Of course, a big thanks to Kate and Nella for organizing this series of workshops, which is terrific. I remembered a few days ago how I quit my guitar lessons at sort of age 12 because I was made to play in public at the music school a few times a year, and I hated that so much that it turned me off the whole thing altogether. So I'm really happy that I won't be playing guitar today, and I think you should be extremely grateful for that as well. I would like to introduce Susie Attiwill, who's already been here twice, and so she's very warmed up by now. We expect you to be peaky. Dean of Interior Design at RMIT School of Architecture and Urban Design, and she's also an educator, writer, and curator. Roseanne Bartley has recently presented her PhD in this space at RMIT. Her roles are educator, writer, curator, and I think I can say reluctant jeweler and ornamental activist.
Facilla maker.
Can you live with that? Susan Conn takes on many roles as well. She's a jeweler, designer, curator, writer, and more recently also a jewellery performer. I myself, Manon van Kouswijk, I'm an artist, I'm a jeweler, I'm an educator, I'm an exhibition maker, occasional curator, and a publisher of artist books. I'm wearing today Object Temporarily Removed by Zoe Brand, an Australian jeweler. And I've chosen this piece because it claims to be missing, and I think that sort of suits a conversation about what might be missing in contemporary jewelry practice. There's also a few things that are happening in this humble button that I think make it a very interesting piece, in the way that it declares its own absence while being present at the same time. It references a missing object. It references museological practice, and I also find the fact very interesting that it is a humble button. I'm also wearing a button today because during a symposium only a few years ago, I think, a well-known jeweler declared very firmly that a button could never be a piece of serious contemporary jewelry. So I think this piece proves that it is possible. I don't think it's easy to make a work in contemporary jewelry that takes on the format of a button, but it's possible. I also think, considering that the visual arts have embraced popular culture in the 1960s, that it is a little bit pathetic that we should still be having a conversation like that in the 21st century in contemporary jewelry. But I do also realize that this is not uncomplicated. It's not as simple as that. And the fact that we are having a conversation like that actually points out that there's a lot of territory that we still have to cover in order to catch up with some of the other visual practices like design and fine art. So I think that, is some of the content of the conversation that we could be having today. So contemporary jewelry in itself is a rather confusing term, and Susan Conn, in her session last week, bravely attempted to tease out some of what might be contemporary about contemporary jewelry. And I think towards the end, the conclusion was that maybe it wasn't that contemporary at all. So for the sake of today's conversation, I would like to say, or I think it might be useful to say, that the practice we are discussing is the practice that, for better or worse, we still call contemporary jewelry. And also towards the end of last week's session, Susie Attiwill gave a very clear description of her understanding of and experience with contemporary jewelry, that she described as a practice that interrupts or disrupts, creates a fissure or a crack in the assumptions, habits, and cliches that make up the present and open up the potential for something not yet defined. So at that point in the conversation, I actually felt like it was really going somewhere, and there was not really enough time. So I'm hoping through some of my questions that we can continue that conversation and hopefully unpack it a bit further. I also have to mention that this series of workshops at Design Hub actually contradicts my question in that it addresses one of the things that I think is very much missing in contemporary jewellery, because it offers an opportunity for a dialogue, not just among jewellers, but also across disciplines. And when I had a conversation with Susie and Bridie last month about this session, they both mentioned that a discourse on practice is very much an integral part of design and fine arts practice, and it's something that is ongoing, and that can be, that is actually part. There are a lot of opportunities created for it. Now, I think these conversations in jewellery are also happening, but they're sort of more taking place in a bar, at the kitchen table, amongst ourselves. And from my experience within, teaching both in art school, within jewellery, but also in fine arts, I just don't see that quite reflected in our field. So, to start our conversation, I would like to ask each of the members of my panel, how would they describe their connection to contemporary jewellery? And who would like to kick that off?
Till death do us part. I'm in for the long haul. It's an addiction. Can't leave it alone.
Good.
Yeah. I think I exhibit something of what Glenn Adamson infers as a ongoing narrative of discomfort. And that can be evidenced in my fidgeting on these kind of uncomfortable chairs, or in the tendency to speak in a fairly ornamented fashion, or even in the practices that I do, creative practices that I do. I'm often unsettled in my relationship to contemporary jewellery, specifically. Jewellery less so. But I also began my practice on the periphery of probably what's referred to, what came up last week as the contemporary jewellery movement. Geographically and historically, that's sort of, I trained on the kind of edge of that. And also the bone, stone and shell movement, which probably is where Lisa also orients some of her work from, which was from New Zealand. Some of you from New Zealand may recall that. So yeah, I think I live and breathe.
You're on the edge.
My what?
On the edge. On edge.
Yes, that kind of disturbed, slightly troubled, uncomfortable, not settled, and curious, deeply curious to know actually what else a practice of jewellery can do, or not, I suppose. I don't know. There.
Maybe I took it a bit literally, just the question.
That's fine.
But, I think it's kind of connects in anyway. And it's just thinking about, just different connections that I've had, really, with contemporary jewellery and its kind of impact. And the first one was really as an exhibition designer, when I was invited to design an exhibition for the Jewellers and Metalsmiths Group annual, I think it was an annual membership show called Production Reproduction. And so that was really my first kind of encounter as, you know, a interior designer, exhibition
when
designer.
was that, Susie?
1995. And I also met Mari Funaki through that, and Susan Conn, and had to deal with Susan Conn's work in that exhibition, which was another story, which I can tell you about if we have time later on. But also
talking though.
yeah. And I guess then from there I became involved with Craft Victoria, and very strongly because of a connection with Con, who was chair at that time. And this is in 1996, 1999. Well, it's not going to take my whole life story, I'm sorry, I won't fill it. But, you know, like I was the first artistic director there, and with Con as chair, so hence, you know, like it was very much this kind of inspiration around what was happening, particularly at that time in contemporary jewellery. It was one of the kind of areas within craft that was really sort of pushing it out there, you know, like in dealing with social and cultural issues, leaving ceramics and glass and all these other things quite, you know, it was the practice. So that was very inspiring. And then as an artistic director working with exhibitions of contemporary jewellery, and also as a wearer. This is I wore this at the other first one that I was speaking on, jewellery material. This is by Alex Murray Leslie. So I'm a wearer and I'm a buyer of contemporary jewellery, and yeah, so there's just all these very nice connections with contemporary jewellery that I found very inspiring over, God, what is it, like now over 20 years, more than 20 years.
Yeah, so I got my training in the Netherlands. I did a very traditional goldsmithing school that was quite long, like 5 years. And then art school was also 5 years, so by the time I finished, I'd been studying for 10 years. And then I was asked if I wanted to do the newly set up masters at the Sandberg Institute, and I thanked for that, because I was studied out for a while. And so I've been practicing ever since, until 2010, mainly based in the Netherlands and working from there. And I suppose my connection with contemporary jewellery is also kind of ambiguous. I love it and I hate it. And I've always been sort of rubbing up against the limitations of it within, you know, sort of gallery practice, and that's ongoing. So I suppose I could also say until death do us part. Yeah, so my idea so Bridie Lunny was also supposed to be on this panel, and unfortunately she cancelled this morning because she felt very unwell. And initially I had Bridie and Susie and myself, so we would have been only 3 people, and we had this initial conversation about, you know, my questions. And then I realized that there were some questions that were quite specific to our practice that I couldn't actually expect them to really engage with. And so that's when I decided to get Con and Roseanne on board. But then this morning, when Bridie cancelled and I walked here through the exhibition gardens, I had this other scenario where I thought, oh, imagine if it would have been just Susie and me, and it could have been like a psychiatric session where, you know, I could be the patient. So
Thank goodness.
You know,
Yeah,
I'm contemporary jewellery.
all right.
And so I'm lying here. I think that was the part that sort of appealed to me most about this. I would just be lying here. And then I would go, I am forgotten. I have been neglected. Something is missing. And then we would workshop that for an hour. We could have.
We can still do that.
Could have worked.
Please. Please.
Can I just say, I don't want to deal with 3 patients.
No, we're watching.
And,
We're taking notes. We're not. We're the interns. We're learning.
But you're all the
Completely,
makers, so you've all been forgotten.
So you will all be psychiatrists at one point, or
Just the
And
interns.
suggest-
We're learning how to ask those questions or what the answers might be.
suggest possible strategies to deal with them.
I don't think it's a new problem though, Manon. I think that's been there from the beginning.
Yeah, but we're still battling with
No,
it.
no,
so,
I know,
you
but that's what's fascinating about it.
that's
is
why you
that
go
it's-
to a shrink at some point, because
What are we,
we think,
what are
well,
we
I'm not
battling with
managing.
here? I'm being the shrink. So could you elaborate on what you're talking about battling with? I'm not quite clear. Sorry, what are you battling with?
Yeah, no, exactly. So it could have, yeah. But
well,
Being
I
forgotten?
think,
or?
let's take this from, yeah.
Okay.
well, I thought
That was just, yeah. No, I would actually like to sort of try and
Move through
move
the
through
questions.
my questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So my first question was, are there eye-opening moments or experiences that you have had with contemporary jewellery that have made a lasting impression or that have shaped your understanding of it? And yeah, anyone who would like to have
I
the
think
first go at that?
because we're with Lisa, we're in Lisa's exhibition. I did want to relate 2 moments I've had with her work where I think I've experienced that. And one was in Object Space in New Zealand, in its previous site. And Lisa had filled that space. She works spatially really interesting, I find, and she had used lots of plinths, different coloured plinths, different sized plinths, with most of them with work on, so there would have been over 100 plinths, so
Do
quite
you know how long ago that was?
Oh, no, that's terrible of me for not...
no.
It might have been unwearable. Yeah. And so there was an amassing of work that is the kind of quantity of which was, quite substantial. But what was really interesting about it was the way you, as the person navigating that space, had to orient yourself towards these works, and in some instances kind of squeeze through, and in others lean over, and so you were activated in ways that were quite pronounced. And aside from the fact that the work itself can also be quite challenging to the normative kind of conditions, I suppose, of jewellery. And then the other one was also in New Zealand, but in Wellington. And I think it was a necklace that's got the mussel shells and glue down the end.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember looking at that going, wow, that's knowing the history of the specific references in New Zealand and the use of material and the kind of negotiations of culture and place that has gone on there. I was like, that's really a really crucial shift in that practice. So I think Lisa's been really part of that story for me. There are others, such as yourself, who we might include in that conversation. Anybody else?
Susie, why don't you go?
Oh, okay. Yep, so I guess a couple of significant moments, and one was an exhibition that I was involved with while I was at Craft Victoria that Susan Conn had organised and brought to Craft Victoria, which was of Gallery Ra. And so it was work, it was called, it was passion and profession. And it was about past, present and future. So it was talking about part of the collection that they have, and then the present in terms of a number of current works, but also, importantly for me, was the kind of posters and so on that they were doing for their exhibitions. And then the future was around the Ra Award. And so it was just, it took up the small space of Craft Victoria, but it was just this array of these amazing kind of works, really. And seeing, it was a bit like a kind of cabinet of curiosities, but something that was really sort of pushing and challenging ideas of, bodies and, what it is to wear something and materials and all sorts of things, and coming back to this idea of really sort of disrupting one's assumptions about things, and also confronting one to sort of negotiate how one kind of would engage with these works. And so there's that, and then I think also Alex Murray Leslie's exhibition at Gallery Funaki that was part of Melbourne Fashion Week, and Crosley Lane here in this, where Gallery Funaki is, was closed off, and there was a fashion parade of people wearing not the t-shirts but dresses, and buying stamps by Otto Kunzli from Gallery Funaki, as part of the exhibition that he had, and then Manon's work as well at Gallery Funaki. The encounters there with, I remember in the front window, this soap, that had a string of pearls in it. It was sort of about, washing, and so just these kinds of series of encounters, really, I think that kind of continue to sort of challenge one and how one's thinking about not just jewellery, the act of making or having jewellery, but how it links up to a much kind of broader and social context.
Yeah, there's many shows that have an effect. But I suppose like any love affair, you go back to the very beginning. And I think one point that had a huge impact on me was Ralph Turner's book, The New Contemporary Jewellery, in which he published in 1975. I hadn't started contemporary jewellery at this stage. I was standing in the Hill of Content and they were unpacking a box and I went, I want that. And I was trying to work out what I was going to do in my life. I was in graphic design and not very good or very happy at it. And jewellery had come onto my horizon because at a dinner party I was nagging people, as I do, like I did, what do you think of contemporary? What can I do that makes my life, something? And someone said, Con, you should do jewellery. You're always talking about how people are wearing jewellery and you like making. So you go, oh yeah? Yeah, I'll give it a go. And so there was a beginning. But with Ralph, at the stage of being suggested about jewellery...
Did you switch from graphic design
Yeah,
to jewellery?
yeah. I didn't study graphic design, I was an apprentice. But having gone from a point of thinking, oh yes, jewellery, and not knowing anything about contemporary jewellery, to discovering this book and seeing this work and learning about this rebellion against commercialism, and that it was taking jewellery into a whole new realm that it had never been before. This whole freedom and this thinking, this connection with social thinking, I was gone. I just completely connected, knew within 6 months of doing the course this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life.
Wow.
So it was, just this burning passion, which hasn't gone away. It needs to be configured every so often, like any good relationship. I suppose the other really point of big impact was in the late 80s when Peter Fuller, the English critic, wrote a review on a show called Jewellery Redefined. And he was a very well-known, he's no longer alive, critic who was quite savage, no holds barred in what he said. And he really, in this review, challenged a smugness that had started to emerge in contemporary jewellery. And this produced this stimulus right across the world, this galvanised makers. They were either in one camp or the other and arguing with each other. Wow. They were just fantastic discussions. And then the discussion broke out through the art school and in other areas. And it was the first time I experienced contemporary jewellery being a catalyst for thinking about values. And I suppose I still hunker after that type of conversation. It was just so... And you were really challenged. You couldn't just generalise or throw things away. You were just brought back to what it was. And that really opened my mind as to how that type of discussion, that challenge, makes you think and makes you consider what you're doing.
Yeah, I think for me it sort of really goes back to art school. Because, well, I mean, I studied goldsmithing, which, you know, was very traditional. I mean, I sort of enjoyed it, but I was never really very good at the sort of technical. I'm just not a very technical person. The technique just didn't...
Like being in your workshop with the no light.
I know. Boy, Susan was shocked when she saw my studio.
Not shocked, I was trying to do something.
It's just like... Because I have one little goldsmithing bench that my dad made when I went to goldsmithing school, and I still have it, but I don't use it very much. It's the most neglected part of my studio, so it's like in a corner, and I only go there when I really need it, and then I actually have to clean it up to work there, because it's like a pile of rubbish. So anyway, that's sort of my relationship to goldsmithing, I guess. And so in art school, you know, that was all completely off the table. Like there was no way that, you know, technique was not interesting or was not discussed, which, you know, I think that that's also questionable in its own way, but for me at that time that was okay. And then at some point, I think, so there were 5 years, and I think towards the 4th year, I was feeling that I wasn't really getting kind of what I needed. We were taught by jewelers as well as visual artists within the jewelry department, which was in itself really good, but there was a kind of extremely hermetic approach to jewelry that I really didn't connect with. And so then at some point we had this exchange project with Munich, students from Munich and Tokyo, and we all went to Japan and did this sort of program there. And so I met Otto Kunzli, and Karl Fritsch was there, and Norman Weber and Volker Atrops. And I saw their work and the way that they were talking about it, and it just sort of opened up this whole other world and way of, you know, dealing with the work, way of talking about the work. And it just seemed so much more diverse than what was happening at the Rietveld at that time.
Can you give us a time frame? When are you talking?
So this was 1994, 93, 94. Yeah. And so then I asked Otto Kunzli whether it would be possible to be an exchange student in Munich, and because that was sort of just before my graduation year. And so I went to Munich during their sort of spring and summer semester, which is when they prepare for the annual exhibition. And that's not a graduation show. It's their annual exhibition, happens every year, and all the students within the entire art school contribute to it. So you can be in your first year and you have to be part of this exhibition and of the entire process of creating it. And so this whole class was, you know, working together, meeting weekly, discussing the ideas for the exhibition, and then preparing and realizing the whole thing from start to finish. And I have seen some of my favorite jewelry exhibitions. I might talk about that later, but some of the best exhibitions in jewelry that I've seen were sort of within that kind of framework. And the whole atmosphere was just, you know, was quite open. The work that the students were doing was incredibly different, and so I just found that an amazing... There was more of a style in Amsterdam, which is something that I'm very allergic to. So, yeah, so that was really good. And then I came back to Amsterdam, and I kind of had more of a kind of foundation where I could start, you know, articulating my own ideas. But then during that year before the graduation, I wasn't getting much support because I was kind of trying to do the opposite of what they were doing, and so nobody really, you know, related to it. So that was a bit difficult, and so I sort of muddled through that for a whole year, and then at the end we had this examination, and there were like 2 external examiners. One of them was a jewelry gallerist, the other one was a visual artist. And the visual artist just completely got it, and he helped me through, you know, because I wasn't really able, like I had done this work, but I wasn't really able to completely articulate what it was that I'd been doing, but he could. And that was a huge help. Yeah, so that was a significant experience for me, I think. So my next question is, what do you view as the specific potential of contemporary jewellery practice? When is it at its best? When do you get excited about it?
Can I just start?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess it's interesting you mention Ralph Turner, because we've never discussed him, but it's a quote that I picked out from this actually by him. So in the gallery Ra, I think he must have been one of the kind of judges, and he just says, it's quoted here, as Ralph Turner declared, jewellery is an outstanding indicator of social movement and change. And I just felt, and you used the term social thinking, and I guess that's along the lines of what I was thinking in terms of a response to this. And then to couple it up with the comments that I said last week around how, that jewellery kind of contemporary jewellery, and this relationship to time as a sort of interruption in the present to sort of open it up for a kind of different negotiation and to a different future. And that's the kind of social thinking, and this idea of an engagement with social change that I think is really kind of critical about contemporary jewellery, and what gets me excited about that. And just maybe, can I just give one example of that?
Yeah, sure.
So, just because I've got this long history with Susan Conn, she keeps popping up, but when I
stick to people.
I
don't go away.
Oh, thanks for the warning.
I've got two things that I think of as an example of that, say, and one was for her exhibition Black Intentions at the NGV, which was, what year was that?
2003.
Yeah. So Susan Conn gave a whole array of people one of these skim rings, Susan Conn in mourning, black anodized ring to wear. And she gave me one. And you had to wear it for a period of time, like a month or summer.
3 months.
Yeah, 3 months. And then it was going to go back into the exhibition. And so you go, oh, great, okay. So you wear it for 3 months, and the black anodized aluminium wears off, so it's, it becomes like this eventually, but as you wear it, it wears off, and so, it scratches and all sorts of things. So just, in the wearing of it, becoming very conscious of, well, do I sort of do something to it to make it look like I've worn it more, or do I etch into it, or do I just wear it? So this ongoing for 3 months, wearing this damn ring, and also not knowing what was going to happen with it. And, they all got collected, and there was a die that was, Susan arranged and did this taxonomy of all the people that she knew through the rings, and put them into different groups. Gangs of people. And, you didn't know what gang or how you'd been classified until you ended up in the, seeing the work in the exhibition. But then, so
they
it's just...
all trusted me.
Yeah, so, that's just this thing of sort of how it starts to articulate this kind of social and society, being part of a society of things, but in a way that's challenging and one has to negotiate. And it's the same with these earrings, and that's why I wore them today. Because sometimes I choose to wear them and other times I choose not to wear them, because they're very clearly, people, that they're very strong in terms of their connection. Not everyone knows that there's Susan Conn earrings, but many people do, especially going to art and design events. So, even though they're not the larger size, which clearly indicates that you're really closely in the tribe, like I've got the ones that are a little bit more out from the tribe and a little bit more now commercially available. But, it is just really interesting just wearing earrings and having to think through these issues. It's not like any other earrings I put on, or, like this ring that they're very different pieces that I have, and I've had this one for 20 years. So one's always negotiating kind of the wearing, but not as an object for me. It's the wearing within a social, cultural milieu, like the present, which is constantly interrupted and reconfigured. So that's what gets me excited about contemporary jewellery.
Now I'm really embarrassed.
I'm going to fast track this. Huh?
Yeah.
No, I'm going to fast track this a little bit because I'm conscious of time and I can expect Eric to go at some point. Just because I think it is sort of important to briefly touch on where we are now and to try and touch on what might be missing. So where are we now? Shall I kick this off? Yeah. So I've sort of written a small description. I think the current model of practice in contemporary jewellery emphasizes authorship above anything else. The artist is expected to have a signature style, and the model is mainly based on the idea of creating one-off, unique pieces of jewellery that are expected to be statement pieces, i.e. in some way spectacular in terms of their expressive visual language or in the way in which they are made, exceptional skill, use of materials, etc. The main audience that are expected to buy this type of work are collectors. That's sort of where I got.
You really drew a line in the sand, didn't you, Manon?
Yeah?
You drew a line in the sand.
I think this is where we have been since pretty much the 1980s, because this model was already existing when I was in art school. And it was sort of happening, It was not as established as it is now, but it was definitely that shift had happened from the democratic ideas, the value of the materials, the questioning of jewelry, into this sort of more like, now it's about me, I'm wearing a so-and-so, and yeah. And so I sort of think that that's also where it kind of comes full circle, because then it's just the next status symbol, isn't it, really? I mean, it's about confirming the status quo. So that's where I think we are. Yes. I don't know.
I think we're more free-falling. There's an aimlessness, free-falling, anything goes. But I think contemporary jewellery is a voice that at its worst is disappearing. Gone.
Sorry?
Contemporary jewellery is a voice that at its worst is disappearing.
Yeah.
And we're
you mean the
grasping
voice,
for air.
The voice that we were previously describing?
Just
or
a voice.
A voice.
It is a voice. It's a practice that's a voice. And at its best, it's on the verge of a revival. It's trying to find itself again. And I think we're talking. Yeah, we're the old guys who scream.
Well, but you've been talking for 25 years,
Yeah.
so have I. So
Yeah,
I mean,
I think the fact that this is happening, that this exhibition is there.
Well, yeah.
So there is that potential. It's not all doom and gloom. But if we don't do something about it, it is going to disappear.
I agree. I think it's going to completely be absorbed into some kind of mainstream if we're not, doing something very serious about it. I mean, I keep, over the last year, I've received these sort of requests from galleries or spaces that call themselves galleries that want to show my work. It's really just based on Instagram, so they've seen some images and they've sort of thought, oh, that looks kind of, whatever. And then they want to show my work. And then I look up the galleries and they're really just shops, They're sort of like, they've got the classic display of like the little shitty showcases and that's the way that they want to exhibit the work, and I just go, oh, I'm dying.
But you don't think that that you couldn't, isn't that what is contemporary jewelry, isn't there a sort of creative kind of intervention to make within this?
Yeah, but I've already been doing that creative intervention in the existing galleries since I finished art school, and they were galleries that were open for those sort of ideas, but I think it should move on from there, I don't want to...
But Instagram, I mean, how do you transform into Instagram, social media, all these things that just...
No, of
That's
course, but
similar
I'm
sort of
actually what I was trying to say by this was that it became clear to me, because these are sort of relatively new galleries, so they don't have that history, and so they don't bring, that necessarily the knowledge of what was happening then to the practice now. And so I sort of felt like for them, it wasn't even about a practice that tries to, disrupt or interrupt or do anything more than just making little things that are going on display. And that's just a shop. It's just commercialism, and it's just a commodity. We're just exhibiting commodities. And that's, I think, very essential, where something gets lost that, I'm not interested in doing that. If that's where it goes, I'll quit.
In a way, the world is a different place than it was when contemporary jewellery first emerged.
In one way, Roseanne, I think a lot of I was talking with someone, just before you go further, this was just really interesting. I was talking to someone about the concept of megatrends, because they said they thought that was a really key abstract of contemporary, and gave me a list of what is defined as a megatrend. And it was really women's rights, gay rights, civil rights. They all existed right back at the very... The only one is our world is being used up, was the environment, was the only different one. So I don't think actually so much has really changed as we think. Maybe the way in which we relate to each other, but I think those overarching concerns... it really made me stop and think. Sorry, just that I couldn't resist cutting in, because it was a real eye-opener for me.
And you're right, those concerns do exist. But I'm sort of curious about how... I find this actually quite a difficult question to answer, and a difficult conversation to almost enter into, because I'm still not quite sure that we have grappled with the kind of practice, that we have a sense of what the practice is capable of or has been capable of, and then what's happened in the intervening times. So, what happened with globalising through social media, the conversation, and what happened to, the differences that were, and perhaps they're still there, that were kind of generating more maybe localised or regional expressions. Like this idea that contemporary jewellery is uniform everywhere in the world, I find really difficult to...
It is problematic.
I can't... That's where I find it really hard to kind of enter into and kind of say, well, what's lacking? And yet we've got kind of more ways of connecting with each other through social media. So in a way that has brought this idea of a community that you can go anywhere in the world and connect into, which has clearly some benefits, but also some sort of almost neutralising or kind of uniformity that seems hard to kind of to grapple with what exactly is kind of both going on but quite not going on. And I sort of wonder if it is within that critical dialogue that we have sort of not really ever dealt with our contemporary jewellery movement and kind of like what was happening then, and how did that kind of, even that in itself is a sort of an umbrella term that hasn't been unpacked to kind of work out, well, what was happening? And I think that I try to break it down in a way by saying, well, there was in effect a new jewellery movement, a new kind of fresh proposition for jewellery that then in the 80s, perhaps earlier in certain regions, began to shift, and it became this kind of more self-reflexive, potentially a postmodern turn within the field. Yeah. And that wasn't universal. That was only happening in very specific places, and filtering out from there. And I must say, Australia, which is where I've spent, the most, the basis of my practice, it was even kind of later coming in here, if at all, in that way. And by that, I'm kind of meaning those practices that really performatively activate the artefact through a critical kind of reflection on its history, its cultural kind of comment, or its technique, and its playing. It's always doubling itself. But within that, there have been subsequent kind of moves or waves, if you like, and Skinner and Murray, Damien Skinner and Murray talk about the relational turn, and I'm just trying to think if there's any others, but they have various different kind of little terms that we may not be kind of even aware of. And so that there's potential now, for other turns to eventuate, but how we
But a lot of the questions, I think all the obvious questions have actually been asked.
But they might
So
not
maybe
have been
we're not-
answered.
Because
so
is
we're
it
talking,
unpacking,
we're talking
deconstructing?
about how there could be a kind of new impulse. And my experience, which is very much also within fine arts, is actually that those particular works, a work like this, a work that represents strong ideas and concepts that really address aspects of jewellery in engaging ways, and this could be throughout any medium, are actually very well understood, within a field like fine arts, for example. So I think those are works that can actually translate and build a bridge with other practices very easily. I think that's where I sort of see space to move.
I think it's there is a lot of concern in the field about what's happening in our institutions in terms of, like we've peaked in terms of almost our global reach in a way, even though we have got new communities coming through. But in terms of our institutions, we're in decline. And maybe I'm not necessarily saying that I think that's a bad thing. I'm just observing that it is also happening.
Yeah.
And so that maybe we are looking at the potential for other modes or mediums to emerge where they're more mobile, or they're just kind of gathering, assembling for very short kind of projects or engagements. That potentially those have, we're seeing a shift in that regard, that we're not sort of investing so much or able to maintain those big organisations or institutions in the same way. I'm not sure,
Yeah. I'm probably slowly at the point where I should be working towards wrapping this up. I realize an hour is way too short to discuss all this, and I had actually hoped to include a bit more audience participation, but we haven't even gotten there quite. So has anyone managed to answer my question of what might be forgotten, neglected, or missing? Is there anyone who would like to respond to that in the audience? Not everyone at the same time, please.
Deathly silence is a response.
That's true. Anyone who would like to respond to it in any other way? If not an answer to the question, an answer to anything that has been discussed.
I can say something if we can.
Yeah, of course.
I just found the question really challenging, like this idea of sort of, what is it? What has been forgotten, identify what's been forgotten, neglected, or missing, because, that sort of seems like contrary a little bit to the idea of contemporary, saying, well, what's been forgotten and identifying it and bringing it back in. Because it just seems to be sort of saying, oh, well, it should be like this.
It's forgotten because it's no longer contemporary.
Yeah. But I guess, I guess also it just made me think of the philosopher Nietzsche, who talks about the importance of forgetting, and that rather seeing forgetting as a negative, to see it as a positive. And because he comes from the position that you have to be able to forget, because you just can't remember it. You can't be in the past all the time. And so forgetting is really sort of critical about kind of having a kind of criticality in the present with a view to the future. So he also talks about this idea of how, you interrupt the present for this word untimely, to open out sort of other things than what's given. And so I was thinking then too, okay, well, what is forgotten in jewellery then in a positive way rather than a negative way? And I guess there are, I think there are things like perhaps nostalgia is something that with contemporary jewellery, and maybe that's it's forgotten, this idea of having a nostalgia for the past. Instead, it's really much more active kind of grappling and engaging with a sort of present to shake it up for a future. And perhaps that's just something that reflects a little bit now, is just there is, we have to be cautious perhaps of a certain degree of nostalgia for something that's past. And so perhaps we should forget that, in some ways, and really, be thinking about kind of this question, coming back to the discussion last week, of contemporary now, and, the challenges within that.
Maybe you could say what could be added to contemporary jewellery.
Oh yeah, you could. So, do you have an idea, or?
Something I was wondering was the kind of the question about the whole, and Con brought it up about the environment and climate change, and I was really interested in the Americans have these amazing groups like the ethical metalsmiths, and I was wondering, within the Australian context, do you think there's a place for positioning jewellery as a driver for a sustainable society? So, maybe that's looking to the future. How could we talk about that? Maybe whether it's to do with material resources or, I'm not quite sure, but maybe that's somewhere we could go. Maybe we could add that to the conversation, thinking about our responsibility, towards being more
I think
sustainable.
it could definitely be an aspect of a contemporary practice. I mean, Roseanne, you've been, working through how you might be able to address some of those things through your practice, not with the idea of resolving climate change, obviously, but
I think,
as a gesture.
I think I probably approach it slightly differently to how I'm understanding what Vicky's saying, and that I view jewellery as a process and practice that perhaps you could say as like a vehicle for working through those ideas, rather than talking about those ideas.
Yeah.
And so it brings almost those really big, often hard to grapple with, distant issues. You can, because of its intimacy, its closeness, its scale, it brings them into a realm where those issues become a little bit more tangible, and that's how I approach it, rather than perhaps a sustainable practice.
So it's kind of not forgetting the agency that jewellery has.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes that's what gets neglected. So maybe it's the other side of forgetting is what shouldn't we forget?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Generosity.
Yeah.
A sense of belonging.
And
all
also
those
maybe
sort of
it is
things.
that thing of,
instead of focusing so much on the artist as the big creator, don't forget that this is a practice that has to speak to other people, because otherwise it doesn't exist.
And that's where
That's where the focus on this selfish kind of authorship thing really fails, I think.
Another approach to contemporary is through, the peer-to-peer. And I kind of felt that's sort of where contemporary jewellery kind of bubbled up from. It's
True.
Trying to speak to your people and be amongst your people with your practice. Not in a
Hippie way.
well, possibly, not in an exclusive way, to make it more relevant than exclusive. But it does, I think, get a bit tripped up on that aspect. at the moment.
But I think also, you know, like authorship's one way of describing it, but this idea of, I think the term maker keeps coming up quite often. And,
Yeah,
you know, you said you wanted to get some makers in to the conversation because Bridie and I wouldn't be able to sort of deal with some of the questions, which I think, and you used the term maker too in your briefing last week, and this idea of making. And I think that's though really important. Is because, and it comes back to conversation with Mark Edgoose on one of the earlier ones around sort of what is jewellery material, and it's this idea of transformation.
Yeah.
You know, making as transformation, and the maker is being you know, and I take your point, like often we think about authorship as, you know, like the author of the work and they're at the centre of this, but if we think about making and the maker in the midst of that, and, you know, I would then say, well, you know, everyone here is also involved in that making process. But, you know, for me, this idea of transformation is the kind of critical, you know, we're transforming things.
And that becomes a relationship between the maker and the object, maker and wearer, and maker and audience too.
Yeah.
It's not just one transformation, and it changes down that tree.
There's no authorship in a sense, because authorship shifts. You know, if authorship is about kind of recognising what's being authored, you know, but making is not necessarily authorship.
And making's not necessarily singular.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
Or maker.
So we've solved it. There you go.
Yeah, we're done. I think this is a good moment to wrap it up. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm sorry that it wasn't more audience engaging, which I had hoped we could do, but I mean, like, as in having questions and some answers to the question and discussing them, but I sort of underestimated the length of this, I think. Yeah. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.